They say a mother's love is unconditional, but what happens when that love is a cage, and your own child holds the key? My daughter asked me not to come to her wedding. She thought I was too fragile, too broken. The truth was far more cruel. She was erasing me, but in trying to bury my past, she handed me a shovel to dig up her own, and the secrets I found, they were rooted in blood and poison. This is the story of how I took back my life, one devastating secret at a time. If you believe in justice, follow my story, hit that like button, and ring the notification bell, because you won't want to miss a single moment of this takedown. The call came on a Tuesday. I remember the specific rumble of the garbage truck as it groaned its way down our street in Havenwood, Oregon, the hydraulic hiss as it lifted and emptied the bins. It was a sound of weekly erasure, of things being discarded and hauled away. I never imagined that on this particular Tuesday, I would be the one put out on the curb. My daughter Amelia's voice came through the phone, not with the warmth of a child calling her mother, but with the crisp, sterile efficiency of a corporate memo. It was as sharp and unforgiving as the November air that rattled the old window panes of the house. "Mom, we need to talk about the wedding." The "we" was always there now. It was never just Amelia. It was Mark and I. I pictured her in my mind, not in the sun-drenched, slightly cluttered home she grew up in, but in the one she inhabited now. A vast minimalist loft in the city, all white walls, polished concrete floors, and glass. A space so curated, it felt less like a home and more like a gallery exhibit. She would be pacing, of course, her expensive AirPods nestled perfectly in her ears, her sleek ponytail swinging like a metronome. Mark's family money, old and formidable, funded this curated perfection, a life I was only ever allowed to glimpse through the filtered lens of her Instagram feed. "Mark and I have decided," she continued, the slight hesitation before the verb telling me everything I needed to know. This was a verdict, not a discussion. "After a lot of consideration, we've decided it would be better if you didn't attend." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was a physical thing, a chasm that opened up right there in my quiet living room, threatening to swallow me whole. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had been the steady heartbeat of my life for 45 years, suddenly sounded like a bomb. I waited for the explosion. It came, not as a bang, but as a carefully constructed, placating whisper. "It's just, we're worried about you," she said, her voice softening into a tone of practiced concern I knew all too well. It was the voice she used when she thought I was being difficult. The excitement, the crowd. "It would all be too much for your condition. You're still so fragile, Mom." My condition. The way she said it made it sound like a terminal illness, a shameful disease to be managed and hidden away. My condition was grief, a deep, cavernous grief for a husband who had died suddenly of a massive heart attack 2 years ago, a man she, in his death, had elevated to sainthood, Richard the provider, Richard the pillar of the community, Richard the perfect father. In her memory, he was a titan. In my reality, he had been a man of rigid schedules, unspoken rules, and a quiet but absolute control that had shaped every corner of my world. His death hadn't freed me. It had simply transferred his authority to his heir, to Amelia. The excuse about my fragility was a bandage, thin and flimsy, slapped over a mortal wound. It was an insult to my strength, to the very act of my survival. I had navigated the labyrinth of probate, sorted through a lifetime of shared possessions, and learned to sleep alone in a bed that still held the ghost of his presence. I was many things, lonely, tired, adrift, but I was not fragile. The truth, the real and ugly reason for my banishment, hung unspoken between us. I was an unsightly blemish on the perfect family portrait she was so desperate to paint. I was a relic from a past she wanted to Photoshop out of existence. I was the modest, small-town mother in a hand-knitted cardigan, a stark and embarrassing contrast to Mark's mother, a woman who summered in the Hamptons and had a standing appointment with a plastic surgeon in Zurich. I didn't fit into the narrative. I was a loose thread on a couture gown, and Amelia, my meticulous, ambitious daughter, was ready with the scissors. I should have screamed. I should have hurled the phone against the wall. I should have unleashed the torrent of rage and hurt that was building behind the dam of my composure. But I didn't. 40 years of being managed, first by Richard and now by Amelia, had worn my voice of protest down to a whisper. Richard had never raised his voice. He didn't have to. A disappointed sigh, a coolly delivered, "Elizabeth, let's be sensible," was enough to make me fold. He had trained me to be compliant, to smooth things over, to prioritize peace, his peace, above all else. Amelia had learned her lessons from the master. She wasn't being cruel, you see. She was being practical. She was managing a problem. And the problem was me. So I swallowed the protest. I let the years of ingrained submission take over. The words came out, automatic, lifeless. "I understand, dear," I said, and the lie tasted like ash in my mouth. "Of course, you have a wonderful day." I hung up before she could offer any more false comfort. The silence that rushed back in was different now. It was heavier, colder. The garbage truck had moved on down the street, its job done. I stood in the middle of the living room, a ghost in my own home, feeling like I too had been discarded. My gaze drifted around the room, over the comfortable, slightly worn furniture, the family photos on the mantel. There was one of me and Richard, taken on our 25th anniversary. We were smiling, but my smile didn't quite reach my eyes. There was another of Amelia as a teenager, bright and fierce even then. It felt like a room full of strangers. I was no longer the matriarch of this family. I was just its caretaker, a warden in a museum of a life that was no longer mine. A week passed. A week of hollow days and long nights, where the house seemed to groan with the weight of its own memories. I moved through my routines on autopilot, watering the plants, dusting the furniture, watching the news. I avoided looking at my phone, at the inevitable, glossy updates on Amelia's Instagram. I didn't need to see the photos of her dress fitting, or the posts about the artisanal, gluten-free, ethically sourced wedding cake. I knew it would all be perfect, perfectly curated, perfectly devoid of me. Then, the invitation arrived. It wasn't slid discreetly through the mail slot. The postman rang the bell, holding a package that required a signature. It was a stiff, oversized envelope, thick as a plank of wood. When I took it, its weight surprised me. It felt significant, final, like a gravestone. I carried it into the living room and sat in my armchair, the one by the window. The envelope was made of the thickest cream cardstock I had ever felt, with the return address of a high-end stationer in the city embossed on the back. With trembling fingers, I broke the wax seal, a pretentious, interlocking A and M, and slid out the contents. The invitation itself was a monument to wealth. Gold leaf script shimmered against the cream paper. The edges were beveled, the font elegant and severe. It was a testament to the fortune Mark's family possessed, a world of power and influence I could barely comprehend. But it wasn't the opulence that made my breath catch in my throat. It was the name written in that flawless, looping calligraphy. It wasn't addressed to me, not to Mrs. Elizabeth Croft. It was addressed to the estate of Richard Croft. I stared at it, the words blurring and sharpening. The estate of Richard Croft. It was a legal term, a cold, impersonal designation for the assets of a dead person. They hadn't just uninvited me, they had unpersoned me. I was no longer a woman, a mother, a widow. I was an addendum to a dead man's legacy, a piece of property, a footnote in the life of my own child. I ran my thumb over my late husband's name, the sharp raised edges of the letters digging into my skin, a small grounding pain in a sea of numb shock. Richard. Always Richard. Even in death, his name, his legacy, superseded my very existence. Amelia hadn't just cut me out. She had legally and formally erased me, demoting me from mother to a mere component of an inheritance she was eager to claim. It was in that moment, sitting in the pale afternoon light with that opulent, cruel piece of paper in my hand, that something inside me finally broke. Not in a soft, yielding way, but in a hard, definitive snap. The years of quiet submission, of swallowing my words and my pain, of making myself smaller to keep the peace, it all curdled. The grief and loneliness I had been nursing for 2 years fermented into something else entirely. It became a hard, cold knot of anger in the pit of my stomach. An anger so pure and clarifying, it felt like waking up from a long, drugged sleep. My gaze, sharp now with this newfound fire, lifted from the invitation. It moved past the photos on the mantel, past the window looking out onto the manicured lawn. My eyes drifted and then locked onto the corner of the living room, to the one object in this house that had always been a mystery. The heavy, dark oak gardening chest that had been Richard's private sanctuary, the one he always kept locked. It sat there, as it always had, solid and silent. But for the first time, it didn't look like a piece of furniture. It looked like a challenge, a locked box of answers in a life suddenly filled with unbearable questions. Richard had loved his garden. It was more than a hobby. It was a religion. Our property in Havenwood wasn't ostentatious, but the grounds were immaculate. He treated the lawn like a sacred text, the flower beds like scripture. He was known for it throughout the community. That Richard Croft, people would say at the local market, he could make a rock sprout flowers. He would just smile, a humble, knowing smile that I now recognized as pure pride. His true pride, his magnum opus, was his collection of prize-winning roses. He called them Midnight Bloom. The name was his own invention. They weren't a recognized horticultural breed. They were his creation, a hybrid he'd spent years perfecting. Their petals were the color of a deep dark burgundy, a velvety crimson so rich that at the edges, in the right light, they looked almost black. They were beautiful, but in a severe, dramatic way. There was nothing soft or gentle about them. They were magnificent and slightly menacing, like flowers from a fairy tale with a very dark ending. He grew them in a small, fenced-off patch of earth behind the greenhouse, a space that was, like the chest, strictly his domain. When I had once asked him, early in our marriage, why the little plot needed a fence and a padlock, he had simply laughed. "Trade secrets, my love," he'd said, tapping the side of his nose. "Can't have the neighbors stealing my methods." And his methods were all tied to that oak chest. It was where he kept his special tools, his custom soil blends, his secret fertilizers. Whenever he spoke of it, his voice would take on a tone of playful mystique. "The secret's in the soil, Elizabeth," he used to say, giving me a conspiratorial wink as he tapped the heavy lid. "And my secrets are all in here." He was the only one with the key, a small, ornate brass key he kept on his personal keychain, separate from the house keys. In our 45 years of marriage, I had never once seen inside that chest. It and the little garden behind the greenhouse were the only two places in our shared life that were completely, unalterably off-limits to me. It was a rule I never questioned. It was just one of Richard's things, but now, sitting in the wreckage of the life I thought I had, Richard's things took on a new meaning. His charming eccentricities now seemed like calculated acts of exclusion. The locked chest was no longer a quirky container for gardening supplies. It was a silent monument to a lifetime of secrets I had been forced to live alongside, but never challenge. It was a symbol of the parts of my husband and my marriage that I was never allowed to know. I placed the gilded invitation on the side table. It lay there, a stark white and gold declaration of my erasure from the future. Across the room, the chest sat in the corner, a dark, locked box of the past. The two objects seemed to be in conversation with each other, pulling me between them. Amelia wanted to lock the door on the past, on me. But that same past was sitting right there, in a locked box, waiting. A feeling I hadn't experienced in decades began to burn through me, melting the cold knot of anger into a hot, determined resolve. It was a burning need to know, not a gentle curiosity, but a fierce, primal insistence on the truth. I had spent my entire adult life respecting boundaries that were set for me, living within the lines drawn by my husband. I had accepted his secrets as part of the price of a stable, comfortable life. I had accepted my daughter's dismissal as the sad, inevitable price of her happiness. I had accepted and accepted and accepted until there was almost nothing left of me. But the woman who had said, "I understand, dear," on the phone was gone. The woman who would have tucked the hurtful invitation away in a drawer to spare everyone's feelings had vanished. In her place was someone new, someone forged in the fire of a profound and deliberate insult. I stood up, the joints in my knees cracking in protest, and walked across the room. I stopped before the oak chest, its dark wood cool and solid beneath my fingertips. I ran my hand over the intricate carvings on the lid, flowers and vines that twisted around a central, unadorned shield. I knelt down and examined the lock. It was heavy, made of brass, now dull with age. I tugged at the lid, my fingers finding no purchase. It was as immovable as a mountain. It was Richard's will, cast in wood and metal. For the first time in my life, I felt a burning need to defy him, to take a hammer to his perfect, polished world and see what lay beneath the varnish. This wasn't just about my own pain anymore. It was for the young woman I used to be, the one in the old photographs with a spark in her eye, before she had been so carefully and methodically pruned back, stem by stem, year by year, until all that was left was a quiet, manageable life in the shadow of a great man and his secret garden. The secret, he had said, was in the soil. I looked from the chest to the window, out towards the garden, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was finally going to start digging. My days dissolved into a disquieting gray rhythm, a life lived through the cold glow of a screen. I had become a digital ghost, haunting the vibrant, sun-drenched periphery of my daughter's existence. I'd wake up, make tea I barely tasted, and sit in the worn armchair by the window, my laptop warming my legs as I scrolled through Amelia's Facebook profile. It was an open diary, and every entry was a fresh page of my own exclusion. There she was, frozen in a burst of professional laughter at her lavish bridal shower. Her head was thrown back, a flute of champagne held aloft, the diamond on her finger catching the light like a cruel star. Her friends, a flock of sleek, smiling women I'd never met, had tagged her in a cascade of photos. The hashtags felt like tiny, sharp pricks against my skin. Hashtag Mark and Amelia's, Perfect Union, #Bridal Bliss, #Future Mrs. Hamilton. Each one was a perfectly curated brick in the wall she was building between us. Every post was a meticulously staged performance of pure, unadulterated joy. Every comment was a public testament to the flawless, enviable life she had so carefully constructed for herself. A life in which I was apparently a bug in the code, a glitch to be deleted. The contrast was a physical blow, a constant, dizzying nausea. There she was, surrounded by light and laughter and crystal flutes clinking in celebration. Here I was, adrift in the oppressive silence of this house, a house that held every memory of her childhood but had no place in her future. The silence was a living thing, punctuated only by the soft click of my mouse and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting down the seconds to a wedding I would never see. When the digital world became too much, my frustration would turn physical. I would abandon the laptop and turn my attention to the real ghost in the room, the old oak gardener's chest. It sat under the bay window in the study, solid and immovable, just as Richard had left it. It mocked me with its stoicism. The lock, an intricate thing of dark, tarnished brass, seemed to stare back at me like a malevolent eye. My first attempts were clumsy, born of a desperation I hadn't felt in years. I tried a hammer, bringing it down with a pathetic, jarring thud that only scuffed the aged wood and sent a shockwave up my arm. The chest absorbed the blow without a tremor. I tried a screwdriver, trying to pry the mechanism, the metal scraping uselessly against the brass, the sound setting my teeth on edge. In a fit of pure, impotent rage, I grabbed the heavy iron fire poker from the hearth. I wedged the tip into the seam between the lid and the body of the chest and threw my entire weight against it. The poker bent slightly, and a tiny splinter of oak flaked away. But the old wood held fast. The lock remained impassive. The past was sealed tight, its secrets guarded by my late husband's intractable will, and I was too weak, too insignificant to break it open. I would slump back into my chair, the smell of dust and my own failure thick in my nostrils, defeated. The doorbell chimed one afternoon, a sharp, intrusive sound that shattered the house's tomb-like silence. I wasn't expecting anyone. My world had shrunk to the postman and the occasional wrong number. I smoothed my cardigan, a nervous habit from a lifetime of wanting to appear presentable, and opened the door. On my porch stood a man who did not belong in Havenwood. He was young, encased in a suit so sharp and gray it seemed to cut the soft afternoon light. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and they looked alien and predatory on my worn wooden porch boards. He held a sleek leather briefcase and a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Mrs. Elizabeth Croft?" he asked, his voice a low, soothing purr that immediately put me on edge. It was the kind of voice men used when they were about to sell you something you didn't need or deliver terrible news. I nodded, my hand still clutching the doorknob. "Yes?" "My name is Jonathan Fields. I'm an associate from Sterling Finch Legal. May I come in for a moment? It's regarding your daughter, Amelia." A cold dread, familiar and slick, washed over me. Amelia. Of course. I stepped back, a puppet pulled by old strings, and allowed him into the hall. He brought with him the scent of expensive cologne and ambition, a smell that felt like a violation in the quiet, lavender-scented air of my home. He followed me into the living room, his eyes scanning the space, taking in the faded chintz of the armchair, the photographs on the mantelpiece, the heavy, dark furniture. I could feel him appraising it all, not as a home, but as a collection of assets. "Please, have a seat," I murmured, gesturing to the sofa. I remained standing, a small act of resistance. He sat, crossing his legs neatly and placing the briefcase on his lap. "Mrs. Croft, Amelia has retained our services because she is, well, she's deeply concerned about you." He opened the briefcase with 2 sharp clicks. The sound echoed in the stillness. "She's worried that with the stress of the upcoming wedding and, of course, your ongoing grief, that managing your own affairs might be becoming overwhelming." The words were wrapped in the silken gauze of concern, but their meaning was as clear and as cold as glass. Overwhelming. He made it sound like I was a doddering old fool, incapable of paying a utility bill. "I'm managing just fine, Mr. Fields," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. He gave me another one of those empty practice smiles. "Of course. But Amelia, in her love for you, wants to make things easier. She wants to ensure you're taken care of, that you have absolutely nothing to worry about. To that end, she's instructed us to draw up these documents." He slid a thick sheaf of papers from his briefcase and placed them on the coffee table between us. The top page was titled in bold, stark letters, "Durable Power of Attorney." My blood ran cold. I stared at the words, the legal jargon swimming before my eyes. He began to speak again, his voice a condescending drone, explaining the clauses, the transfer of authority, the complete and total control it would grant Amelia over my finances, my property, my medical decisions, my life. "It's a simple formality, really," he said smoothly. "It just allows Amelia to step in and handle things should the need arise. She feels, for instance, that this house is becoming far too much for you to maintain on your own. Her preliminary thought is that after the wedding, it would be best for everyone if she managed its sale." The room seemed to tilt. The sale of my house. This house. The one Richard built. The one I filled with memories. The one where I raised the very daughter who is now trying to rip it out from under me. "The sale?" I whispered, the word catching in my throat. "And where would I go?" Mr. Fields finally dropped the pretense of a smile. His expression became one of grave, professional sympathy. "Amelia has already looked into several excellent assisted living facilities nearby, places with round-the-clock care, activities. She wants to ensure you're in a safe, secure environment where your cognitive state can be monitored." Cognitive state. The phrase landed like a punch to the gut. They weren't just banning me from the wedding. That was just the first cut. This was the plan all along. They were going to have me declared incompetent, evict me from my own life, and pack me away in a sterile beige room in a place that smelled of bleach and despair. They would sell my memories, my history, to the highest bidder, and use the profits to fund their perfect, flawless future. For years, fear had been my constant companion. Fear of Richard's moods, fear of Amelia's disapproval, fear of being alone. It had been a paralytic, a quiet poison that kept me small and silent. But in that moment, as the lawyer's chilling words hung in the air, that old fear underwent a violent alchemy. It didn't vanish. It ignited. It flared into a cold, protective fury I hadn't known I possessed. It was the rage of a cornered animal, the fierce, primal instinct to protect one's own territory, one's own self. I lifted my chin and looked Jonathan Fields directly in the eye. For the first time, I didn't see a formidable legal shark. I saw a messenger boy, a well-dressed errand runner for my monstrously selfish daughter. "Mr. Fields," I said, and I was astonished by the steadiness of my own voice. It was a voice I hadn't heard in decades. It was clear and hard as flint. "You can take your papers and your condescending concern, and you can get out of my house." He blinked, taken aback. The smooth facade cracked for a fraction of a second. "Mrs. Croft, I don't think you're fully understanding the—" "I understand perfectly," I cut him off. "I understand that my daughter sent a vulture to my door to try and strip me of my home and my dignity. Tell Amelia that if she is so concerned about my cognitive state, she should try developing one of her own that includes empathy. Now, leave." I pointed toward the door. The gesture was sharp, definitive. There was no tremor in my hand. He stared at me for a long moment, his mind clearly recalibrating. The polite, concerned professional vanished, replaced by a cold, assessing glare. He slowly, deliberately, gathered his papers, slid them back into his briefcase, and snapped it shut. He stood up, towering over me, a final petty act of intimidation. It didn't work. I didn't flinch. "You'll be hearing from us again, Mrs. Croft," he said, his voice now stripped of its false warmth. "I look forward to it," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. I walked him to the door and watched as his gleaming shoes retreated down my porch steps. I closed the door, slid the bolt home, and leaned against the solid wood, my heart hammering against my ribs, not with fear, but with a wild, terrifying, and exhilarating strength. The battle had been declared. And for the first time in my life, I had no intention of surrendering. That evening, the adrenaline had faded, leaving a residue of exhaustion and a grim, cold resolve. I found myself back in the study, staring at the gardener's chest as if it held the answers to a war I had just been forced to wage. I was tracing the unyielding line of the lid with my finger when a quiet voice spoke from the doorway. "Grandma?" It was Leo, my grandson, Amelia's son from her first brief marriage, a relic from a life she'd rather forget. He was 17, all lanky limbs and quiet, observant eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He was the antithesis of his mother's loud, performative nature, a creature of shadow and stillness in a family that demanded the spotlight. He was holding a glass of water. He'd probably heard the whole exchange with the lawyer. He walked into the room, his sneakers silent on the old rug. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. He glanced at the lawyer's business card, which I'd left on the table like a piece of venomous evidence. "She's being awful, isn't she?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a simple acknowledgement of a truth we both knew. It was an offering of allegiance. Tears I hadn't allowed myself to shed in front of the lawyer pricked at the back of my eyes. "Yes, Leo, she is." His gaze shifted from my face to the oak chest. He saw the new scuff marks near the lock, the faint bend in the fire poker I'd left leaning against the wall. He saw my defeat. "What's in there, Grandma?" "I don't know," I confessed, my voice thick with a sudden, weary honesty. "I truly don't. Only that it belonged to your grandfather. He never let me see inside, and right now, I feel like I need to get into it more than anything in the world." He didn't ask why. He didn't ask what I expected to find. He accepted my need as a valid and urgent mission. That was the gift of Leo. He didn't require the elaborate justifications his mother demanded. He simply saw, and he understood. He took a small step closer, pulled his phone from his pocket, and leaned down. The camera flash was a sudden bright star in the dimming room as he snapped a high-resolution photo of the intricate brass lock. Then he sat on the floor, cross-legged, and began tapping and swiping at the screen, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was scrolling through forums, watching videos, his digital native mind navigating a world of information that was utterly alien to me. He was silent for the better part of an hour. I just sat in the armchair watching him, a strange sense of hope beginning to push back against the despair. Finally, he looked up. "Okay," he said softly. "I think I have an idea. Do you have any paper clips?" I found a small box of them in the desk drawer. He took two, and with the patient precision of a surgeon, he unbent them, creating two thin, straight pieces of wire. Then he disappeared into the bathroom and returned with one of my bobby pins, which he proceeded to bend into a small L shape. A tension wrench, he called it. He knelt before the chest, a modern-day locksmith armed with household junk and knowledge gleaned from the internet. He slid the bobby pin into the bottom of the keyhole, applying a gentle, constant pressure. Then he inserted the tip of the first paperclip, probing the inside of the lock. The room was so quiet, I could hear the faint, metallic scrape of the wire against the pins inside the mechanism. It was a delicate, intimate act. He was listening to the lock, feeling its secrets. Click, a tiny, soft sound. He'd set the first pin. His face was a mask of concentration. Click, the second. My breath caught in my chest. Click, click. Two more in quick succession. He withdrew the paperclip and used the second one, its end bent into a tiny hook to rake the final, stubborn pin. He worked with a focused grace that was mesmerizing. And then, a sound that was nothing like the others. It wasn't a click. It was a deep, resonant thud. A sound of finality. The sound of release. The core of the lock turned a fraction of an inch, and the mechanism disengaged with a heavy sigh of metal. Leo sat back on his heels, a faint, proud smile on his lips. "It's open," he said. He looked at me, his quiet eyes full of a shared victory. The key to my husband's past hadn't been forged from iron or brass. It was knowledge. It was the quiet, unassuming loyalty of a grandson who saw his grandmother in pain and simply decided to help. I reached out and put my hand on his shoulder, a wave of gratitude so immense it left me speechless. Together, we reached for the heavy oak lid. I lifted it, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The hinges groaned in protest after decades of silence. The first thing that hit me wasn't a sight, but a smell. It wasn't the comforting, dusty scent of old wood and forgotten linens I had expected. It was a sharp, sterile chemical odor, layered over the dry, loamy smell of decaying earth. It was the smell of a laboratory disguised as a storage chest. My eyes adjusted to the dim interior. There were no property deeds, no secret bundles of cash, no sentimental keepsakes from a hidden life. The chest was filled with an obsessive, horrifying collection. Lined up in neat, custom-built wooden racks were dozens of small glass vials. Each one was sealed with a cork stopper and contained a small, macabre specimen. A lock of dark hair, a snippet of blonde, a carefully clipped fingernail, a small, yellowed toenail, and each vial was meticulously labeled with a piece of tape, on which was written, in my husband's precise, architectural script, a name and a date. I read one at random. Harold Jennings, August 1998. Mr. Jennings. Our old neighbor, the one who'd had a sudden fatal heart attack while weeding his petunias. My stomach lurched. I felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the floor had dropped away beneath me. Beneath the racks of vials was a stack of small, leather-bound journals, identical to the ones Richard used for his gardening notes. I picked up the topmost one, my fingers trembling so badly I could barely turn the cover. Richard's familiar, neat handwriting filled the pages, but this was no gardener's log. It wasn't a record of bloom times and fertilizer schedules. It was a ledger of death. I sank onto the floor, my legs no longer able to support me, and began to read. The prose was clinical, dispassionate, chillingly scientific. He detailed his experiments with toxins, poisons he had cultivated and extracted from the very plants in our garden. The garden he had been so proud of. The garden I had helped him tend. An entry from 1995. Subject, Martin Weller. Issue, business rival, close to exposing fraudulent accounting, a threat to stability. Method, oleander leaf tincture, introduced into his personal whiskey decanter during the annual firm retreat. Properties, potent cardiac glycoside. Result, diagnosed as a massive myocardial infarction. Business secured. The Midnight Bloom roses are thriving this year. They seem to enjoy the new compost blend. I felt bile rise in my throat. The Midnight Bloom roses, his prize-winning flowers, their roots fed by, what? I flipped through the pages. A gallery of horrors. There was Harold Jennings, the neighbor who complained about the property line. His solution had been a potent tea brewed from foxglove. There was a former lover from before he met me. A woman who had threatened to talk to his investors. She was weeded out with a concentrate made from deadly nightshade. The man I had married, the man I had lived with for 35 years, the respected Richard Croft, a pillar of the Havenwood community, was a poisoner, a serial killer. His garden wasn't a sanctuary. It was an arsenal. The secrets he'd spoken of weren't in the soil. They were in the bodies he had put under it. I sat there on the floor of his study, the chemical smell of the chest filling my lungs, surrounded by the ghosts of my husband's victims, the entire architecture of my life collapsing into a foundation of murder and lies. Leo was silent beside me, his hand resting on my back, a small warm anchor in a world that had just been torn apart. My hands shook so violently I could barely hold the last journal. It was thinner than the others. The last few pages. Something was different. As I turned to the final entries, my blood froze. The handwriting changed. The precise, angular script of my husband was gone, replaced by a rounder, more adolescent hand. A familiar loop in the Y, a distinct curve of the A. I had seen this writing on 1,000 birthday cards, on school projects taped to the refrigerator, on thank you notes written under duress. It was Amelia's. The entry was dated 2 days before Richard's death, the death the coroner had ruled a massive, tragic coronary. I began to read, and the world dissolved into a meaningless blur of black ink on a white page. Amelia, then a sharp, observant 16-year-old, wrote that she had been looking for a book in the study and had found the key to the chest, which her father had carelessly left on his desk. Curiosity, she wrote, had gotten the better of her. She described finding the journals, the vials. She wrote of her initial horror, the revulsion. But then, the tone of the entry shifted into something else, something cold and terrifyingly lucid. She wrote that Richard had become a liability. He was getting sloppy. The death of the neighbor, Mr. Jennings, had drawn whispers. People were asking questions. Her father, the great protector, had become a risk to the comfortable life he had built for them. A risk to her future. Daddy always taught me to be pragmatic, she had written, her teenage script a horrifying counterpoint to the words. He taught me how to protect our family. He taught me what to do with weeds. The final sentences made the air leave my lungs in a silent, agonized scream. I used the foxglove tincture he perfected, the one he used on Mr. Jennings. I put it in his evening tea, just like he always liked it. It was painless, fast. They said it was his heart. In a way, it was. His weak heart was going to ruin us. I saved us. I saved me. The journal slipped from my nerveless fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud. She hadn't just discovered his secret and covered for him out of fear or misguided loyalty. She had learned from him. She had judged him. And she had executed him, using his own methods, his own poison. She wasn't just the keeper of his secret. She was his apprentice, his successor. The cold, calculating cruelty I had just witnessed in her attempts to disown me, to institutionalize me. It wasn't a new development. It was the fruit of a tree planted long ago in the poisoned soil of this very house. My grief for my husband, a complex 35-year-old tapestry of love and fear, evaporated in an instant, replaced by the chilling, absolute certainty that I had spent my life sleeping next to one monster and raising another. The grief I expected, the tidal wave of sorrow for my husband and the daughter I had lost, never came. It was as if the shock of Amelia's final, damning confession had cauterized the wound before it could bleed. In its place, something else grew. It was a cold, hard thing, a purpose so clear and crystalline, it felt like a shard of ice lodged in my chest. Revenge was a word for soap operas, for lesser hurts. This was not revenge. This was a geological excavation, a systematic unearthing of a poisoned family history, layer by rotten layer. This was justice, served cold from the very soil Richard had so lovingly corrupted. My emergency savings, a pathetic little fund scraped together from cash back on groceries and the occasional returned purchase, was meant for a broken water heater or a medical emergency. This, I decided, qualified. I didn't drive anymore. Richard had always said my nerves were too shot. So I took the early bus to Portland, the one that smelled of damp wool and stale coffee. The rhythmic jostling of the bus was a comfort, a mechanical heartbeat against the silent thrumming in my own veins. The city was a world away from Havenwood's manicured lawns and whispered judgments. Here, I was anonymous, a ghost in a worn coat, my face just one among thousands. It was liberating. I didn't seek out a family lawyer from a polite firm with mahogany desks and complimentary bottled water. I searched online for a warrior. The reviews for Anya Sharma were visceral. A shark, relentless, will eviscerate the other side. Her office was in a sleek glass tower that scraped the sky, a place of sharp angles and cold modern art. She was younger than I expected, with eyes that missed nothing and a handshake that could crush stone. She didn't offer condolences or platitudes. She offered a chair and said, "Let's not waste each other's time. What's the problem?" I didn't begin with Amelia's phone call or the insulting wedding invitation. I began with the truth. I slid the photocopied pages of Richard's journal across the polished surface of her desk. I had copied the most damning entries, the ones that read like a murderer's ledger. I watched her read. For the first few minutes, her professional composure was a perfect, impenetrable mask. Then, I saw it. A subtle shift, the slight widening of her eyes, a tightening at the corner of her mouth. She looked up from a page detailing the slow poisoning of a business partner who'd threatened a buyout, her gaze meeting mine. For a single, unguarded moment, the shark was gone, replaced by a human being confronted with an abyss. "My God," she breathed, the words barely a whisper. She pushed the papers back slowly, as if they were radioactive. "This is unprecedented." "He was my husband for 40 years, I said, my voice flat. "And my daughter learned from him." I then told her everything else. The phone call, the power of attorney, Amelia's plan to sell my home and put me in a facility where I could be forgotten. Anya listened without interruption, her focus absolute. The shock in her eyes was replaced by something else, a cold, focused anger that mirrored my own. When I finished, she leaned forward, her hands steepled. "Mrs. Croft," she said, her voice now devoid of any emotion but grim resolve. "Your daughter has made a critical error. She underestimated you. We will ensure it is the last mistake she has the opportunity to make regarding your welfare or your assets." That week was a blur of legal documents and strategic planning. Anya's office became my war room. We didn't just draft a new will. We forged a fortress. An ironclad trust was established, a complex legal structure designed to be utterly impenetrable. Every asset I possessed, every dollar Richard had accumulated through his bloody enterprise was funneled into it. The house, the land it stood on, my meager savings, and the principal jewel in the crown, Richard's life insurance policy. It was surprisingly, almost obscenely large, a final insult from a man who valued his legacy more than any life. All of it, every last cent, was to be placed into a new charitable foundation. Anya suggested a name, but I already had one. "The Havenwood Victims Foundation," I said. "It will be dedicated to the families of the names in that journal." Anya nodded slowly, a flicker of something that might have been admiration in her eyes. "And for your daughter?" she asked, her pen poised over the document. "What do we leave for Amelia?" I thought of Amelia's bright, cruel smile. I thought of her standing on the precipice of her perfect new life. A life built on her father's crimes and her mother's erasure. "Amelia's name will be mentioned only once," I said, the words tasting like metal and earth. "It will read, 'To my daughter Amelia, from whom I learned the true meaning of legacy, I leave nothing, nothing but the soil she so diligently tended.'" As I signed the final document, the heavy, expensive paper cooled beneath my hand. A memory surfaced. It wasn't gentle or welcome. It broke through the surface of my consciousness with the violence of a body dredged from a lake, a memory I had pushed down so deep I'd nearly convinced myself it never happened. I was in the kitchen. The yellow linoleum, cracked near the stove, felt cold against my stockinged feet. Sunlight streamed through the window over the sink, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and the fresh, ugly bruise blooming high on my cheekbone. Richard's ring, had caught me when I'd turned too quickly, a flash of gold and a burst of pain. I wasn't wailing. I had learned long ago that loud crying only made him angrier. I was crying silently, my shoulders shaking as I gripped the edge of the porcelain sink, the tears dripping, unheeded, into a pile of potato peelings. The doorway darkened. It was Amelia. She was 10. Her hair was in 2 neat braids, her face scrubbed clean. She didn't run to me. She didn't ask what was wrong or offer a hug. She stood there, a small, still figure in the frame of the door, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked at the bruise, then at my tear-streaked face. Her expression was not one of fear or pity or concern. It was one of cold, detached analysis. She was a scientist observing a failed experiment. "You just need to learn not to make him angry, Mother," she said. Her voice was as clear and untroubled as a bell. It wasn't a child's attempt to make sense of a frightening situation. It was a judgment, a diagnosis. In that moment, she wasn't my daughter, a fellow captive in this gilded cage. She was his apprentice. She had been watching him, studying his moods, his triggers, his methods. She wasn't learning how to survive him as I was. She was learning how to be him. She was learning where the power was. The memory, so raw and vivid, acted like a chemical solvent. It dissolved the last, stubborn residue of maternal guilt, the lingering toxic hope that somewhere beneath the polished, ruthless woman was the little girl I had once loved. That little girl had never really existed, or if she had, she'd been overwritten, erased by a colder, more patient personality. She was never a victim cowering alongside me. She was his student, watching, learning, and waiting for her turn to take control. My grief for the daughter I thought I had, the daughter I had just disinherited, withered, and died. It left behind nothing but cold, clear ground. The next step required an ally. I couldn't do it alone. There was only one person I could trust. One person who existed outside the corrupted orbit of Richard and Amelia. Leo, my grandson. He came over that afternoon, ostensibly to fix my lagging Wi-Fi router. He found me in the living room, sitting in Richard's armchair, the photocopied journal pages spread out on the ottoman before me like a tarot reading from hell. He saw my face and his easy smile faltered. "Grandma, are you okay? You look..." He trailed off, searching for the right word. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse, Leo," I said, my voice raspy. "I've seen a monster, and I need to show him to you." Telling him was the hardest thing I have ever done. I watched his young face, so open and familiar, twist as I spoke. I saw it cycle through the predictable stages, confusion giving way to disbelief, the certainty that his grandmother had finally lost her mind. He kept shaking his head, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. "No, that's crazy. Grandpa Richard, he grew roses." I didn't argue. I just pushed the pages toward him. I watched him pick one up. I saw his eyes scan the neat, controlled script. I saw the moment the horror landed, the moment the words on the page became real to him. His face went pale, the blood drained from it, leaving his skin looking like parchment. He dropped the page as if it had burned him. "This is a joke," he whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice. "This is some kind of sick joke." "Look at the last page, Leo," I urged him gently. I pointed to the final entry, the one I had saved for last. I saw him recognize the looping adolescent handwriting, his own mother's. I watched him read the confession of patricide, the cold, triumphant words of a 16-year-old girl. "I saved us." He looked up at me, and the boy I knew was gone. In his place was a stranger, looking at a stranger. He saw his grandmother, the woman who made him cookies and helped with his history homework, and he saw a gatekeeper to a family legacy of unimaginable darkness. The horror in his eyes was slowly being replaced by a quiet, grim understanding. He wasn't just processing the truth about his grandfather, he was processing the truth about his mother. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice barely audible. And so I told him. I laid out the plan, piece by monstrous piece. It was not a plan for the police. The journals were copies. My word against the sterling reputation of the Croft family. It would be buried in legal challenges and doubt. No, this required something more. It required a stage. It was theatrical. It was cruel. It was, I thought, perfect. And he, my quiet, unassuming grandson, was the star. Amelia put you in charge of the AV for the rehearsal dinner, didn't she? I asked. He nodded, a dazed look on his face. Yeah, she wants a slideshow. You know, baby pictures, them on vacation in Cabo, all that garbage. It's for the big dinner at the country club tomorrow night. She trusts you, I stated. A bitter, humorless smile touched Leo's lips. She doesn't trust me. She just knows I can work a laptop and I won't charge her for it. He looked down at his hands. She won't even notice I'm gone until it's too late, he said, his voice low and heavy with years of casual neglect. She never does. That was his answer. We spent the rest of the day preparing. Our rehearsal space was the darkened living room. Our tools were my simple voice recorder and his smartphone. I recorded myself reading the selected entries from Richard's journals, my voice steady and clear, narrating a story of poison and greed. Leo, with a technical proficiency that amazed me, figured out how to create a secure, remote feed. He could control the entire presentation at the country club from his laptop, right here in this house. He filmed the garden, the camera lingering on the midnight bloom roses, their dark petals looking black in the fading light. We planned every second, every image, every word. It was a monstrous piece of collaborative art, a eulogy and an indictment all in one. The night of the rehearsal dinner, the air in Havenwood was thick with anticipation and the scent of expensive perfume. It was the social event of the season. Mark's family, real estate developers and investors from Seattle, had flown in. The mayor was there, schmoozing with local business owners. The grand dining room of the Havenwood Country Club was a sea of glittering jewelry and starched collars. From the photos that had already been posted on Instagram, Amelia was the radiant center of it all. She wore a dress of white silk, a vision of untouchable purity, laughing as she raised a champagne flute to toast her future, her handsome fiancé, her perfect, perfect life. I didn't go. I sat in Richard's worn leather armchair, the original journals resting in my lap, their physical weight a strange comfort. The house was silent around me, the kind of deep, waiting silence that precedes a storm. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't triumphant. I felt a strange, profound calm, the calm of a person who has accepted the consequences of their actions before they have even been set in motion. I had made my choice. The rest was just machinery. At precisely 9 o'clock, my phone, resting on the side table, lit up. A single text from Leo. It contained one word. Now. In the grand dining room of the country club, filled with the murmur of polite conversation and the clinking of crystal, the lights began to dim. A hush fell over the room as all eyes turned to the large projection screen at the front. The slideshow began exactly as planned. A photo of a chubby baby Amelia in a bathtub, a shot of her and Mark grinning on a ski lift, a montage of family vacations, carefully curated to project an image of idyllic happiness. On screen, Amelia beamed, squeezing Mark's hand, her face a perfect mask of bridal joy. Then the screen flickered and went black. A confused murmur rippled through the room. A few people chuckled, assuming a technical glitch. Amelia's smile tightened. She shot a sharp, annoyed look toward the back of the room where the AV booth was. But the screen did not stay black. A new image slowly faded in. It was shaky, raw, lit only by the narrow beam of a flashlight. The image was of my garden, my midnight bloom, rose bushes, their petals like black velvet against the night. Then, the camera panned to reveal Leo, my grandson, his face grim and smudged with dirt, holding a shovel. Before anyone could fully process what they were seeing, a voice filled the silent, cavernous room, amplified by the club's expensive sound system. It was my voice. Clear, steady, and devoid of emotion. My husband, I began, had a secret. I started to read. I read the names of the victims from Richard's journal. August 12, 1998. Arthur Wembley, neighbor. Complained about property lines. Oleander tea steeped for 3 hours. Effective. A collective gasp went through the room. The silence was no longer polite. It was thick with horror. I kept reading. March 3, 2005. Eleanor Vance, business competitor. Aconite, sourced from my own garden, administered over 2 weeks in her afternoon coffee. No one suspected a thing. People were turning to stare at Amelia, whose face had gone from annoyed to ashen. She was on her feet, her white silk dress a stark beacon in the dim light. "Stop it!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Turn it off! Someone turn that off!" A few of Mark's groomsmen scrambled towards the AV booth, but the door was locked. The system wasn't being controlled from inside the room. It was being controlled by a feed from miles away. From Richard's armchair, there was nothing they could do. On the screen, the camera feed cut from the garden to a close-up of Mark's face in the audience. He was staring at Amelia, his own face a mask of dawning, sickening comprehension. The handsome fiancé was gone, replaced by a man looking at a complete and terrifying stranger. My voice continued, relentless. I read these names not for condemnation, but for acknowledgement. These were people. They had families. And they were erased for convenience. Then came the finale. The shaky footage of the garden disappeared, replaced by a single, high-resolution, full-screen image. It was the final page of the journal. Amelia's childish, looping script was unmistakable, magnified for all to see. My recorded voice read her words aloud. "Dad is a liability. He's getting sloppy. I took care of it. His own digitalis extract. They'll call it a heart attack. I saved us." A wave of revulsion swept through the guests. People were recoiling from Amelia's table as if she were contagious. As my voice read her confession, the video feed switched back to the garden. Live. It showed Leo on his knees, his shovel having struck something solid in the dirt beneath the midnight bloom roses. He began to dig with his bare hands, pulling away the dark, rich soil. He heaved, and a small, rotted wooden box was pulled from the earth. The camera zoomed in on the box as my voiceover delivered the final lines, a calm, conversational benediction. "Welcome to the family, Mark. The secret, you see, is in the soil." Then the screen went dark, and the screaming began. The aftermath was not a storm. A storm is a natural event, a chaotic but ultimately temporary force of nature. What followed the rehearsal dinner was a detonation, a man-made, deliberate act of demolition where the blast radius was my entire life, and the fallout would never truly settle. I didn't see it happen, not directly. Leo had wisely guided me out a side exit the moment the room's stunned silence had curdled into gasps and shouts. He drove me home through streets that were still peaceful, still unaware that their quiet little corner of Havenwood was about to become the epicenter of a national obsession. The first I knew of the official proceedings was the piercing shriek of sirens, getting closer and closer until they stopped, it seemed, right on my front lawn. I sat in Richard's armchair, the one he always favored, and watched through the sheer curtains as flashing red and blue lights painted frantic, strobing patterns across my living room walls. It was Mark's father who had called them. A practical man, a man of action. While others were screaming or fainting or simply staring in catatonic disbelief, he had pulled out his phone and done the only logical thing. He had called the police on his son's fiancée. I learned the rest from the news, just like everyone else. My home, once a sanctuary, had become a screen. I watched a jittery, handheld video on my laptop, filmed by some wedding guest who had the presence of mind to hit record. I saw Amelia, my daughter, her face a mask of contorted fury and animal panic. She wasn't weeping, she was screeching, a raw, primal sound of a predator caught in a trap. She was pointing, her finger jabbing towards the empty space where the projection screen had been, her words incoherent, a torrent of accusations and denials that made no sense. She looked wild, possessed. When the police officers, calm and methodical, moved towards her, she fought them. It took 2 of them to guide her, still thrashing, out of the grand ballroom and into the glare of the flashing lights. By sunrise, it was everywhere. The name they gave her was both lurid and cruelly poetic, the Poison Garden Bride. It had the ring of a Gothic fairy tale, a story too grotesquely perfect to be true, but it was true, and the media devoured it. Every major news network, every sleazy online tabloid, every true crime podcast looking for its next big hit, they descended on our story like vultures on a fresh kill. My quiet suburban street, a place where the biggest event was the annual block party, transformed overnight into a sprawling, impromptu media encampment. News vans with massive satellite dishes on their roofs lined the curbs, their thick black cables snaking across my lawn like invasive vines. Reporters with microphones and cameras stood in grim-faced clusters, doing their live stand-ups with my house, my home, as their grim backdrop. The headlines were a relentless assault. Heiress accused of patricide in shocking wedding revelation. The Croft family's deadly secret, a father's sins, a daughter's crimes. From society, darling to handcuffed bride, the fall of Amelia Croft. They dug up everything. Old family photos from happier times were splashed across websites, their smiling faces now looking like macabre death masks. They interviewed estranged cousins I hadn't spoken to in 20 years. They talked to Amelia's old teachers, her sorority sisters, the florist for the wedding. Everyone had a theory, an opinion, a soundbite. My face was on the screen too. A grainy photo from Richard's funeral, looking frail and lost. They painted me as the tragic, victimized matriarch, the unsuspecting widow. Then, as Leo's role in the reveal became public, the narrative began to shift. Was I a victim or the mastermind? A grieving mother or a vengeful puppeteer? The online forums went into a frenzy. On Reddit threads and Twitter feeds, they called me a hero, a monster, a savage grandma, a karmic avenger. I was a meme, a hashtag. My pain, my life, my family's implosion had been reduced to content, packaged for mass consumption. The house became a tourist attraction. Cars I didn't recognize would drive slowly past, the occupants pointing their phones, taking pictures as if it were a landmark. I saw a young couple, they couldn't have been more than 20, posing for a selfie on the sidewalk, my home looming behind them. They were laughing. I felt a surge of something hot and bitter in my chest. This was my life. This was the wreckage of my family. And to them, it was just a good story, a thrilling detour on a Sunday afternoon. The phone rang constantly, a shrill, insistent demand. I never answered. The doorbell was the same, a constant chime followed by the thud of fists against the wood when I didn't respond. I unplugged the phone. I sat in the deepening shadows of the living room and watched the circus outside my window, feeling like a ghost in my own home. The world was so loud, so full of opinions and speculation and noise, but inside the house, a new kind of silence was beginning to form. A heavy, profound silence that was far more terrifying than the clamor outside. The yellow police tape was the final indignity. It stretched across the entrance to the garden, a garish plastic scar on the landscape Richard had so meticulously cultivated. Police line, do not cross. It barred me from the one place I might have found some semblance of peace. The garden, the source of all the poison, was now a protected crime scene. The irony was suffocating. With the media camped on my lawn and the garden cordoned off, the house became an echo chamber. Every footstep on the old floorboards, every creak of the house settling, every sigh that escaped my lips seemed to amplify in the stillness. It was a hollow, ringing quiet, the kind of silence that follows a massive explosion when the air is still thick with dust and the ringing in your ears hasn't yet faded. This was the silence of aftermath, the silence of ruin. I had won. The word echoed in the empty spaces of my mind, a flat, toneless pronouncement. I had achieved everything I set out to do. I had protected Richard's legacy from being a lie. I had stopped Amelia from seizing control, from casting me aside like a piece of old furniture. I had unearthed the truth and held it up for the entire world to see. Her world, so carefully constructed, so immaculately curated, was now a pile of rubble. I had razed it to the ground, but there was no triumph in it. There was no surge of satisfaction, no righteous vindication. I had expected to feel Something. Relief, perhaps. Closure. Instead, all I felt was the profound, soul-crushing weight of what I had done. It settled over me like a lead blanket, pressing the air from my lungs. I would sit in Richard's armchair for hours, staring at the dust motes dancing in the slivers of light that pierced the drawn curtains, and I would think of Amelia. Not the snarling, monstrous woman on the television screen, but the little girl with scraped knees who used to bring me handfuls of wilting dandelions, her face beaming with pride. The teenager who learned to navigate her father's moods with a chilling proficiency, whose small shoulders carried a burden I had never been strong enough to see. I had destroyed my child, my daughter. The last living piece of my family, save for Leo. I had done it to free myself, to reclaim the life she and her father had stolen from me piece by piece. But now, in the deafening quiet of my victory, I had to ask myself the question that coiled in my gut like a serpent. Was the freedom worth the price? Was this hollowed-out existence, this life defined by what it had destroyed, truly freedom? I had escaped the gilded cage, yes, but I hadn't flown. I had simply stepped out of one prison and into another, this one built of silence, infamy, and a grief so total it felt like it had replaced the blood in my veins. I would drift through the rooms of the house, my hand trailing along the walls, the furniture. Everything felt alien, tainted. This was the dining room where Amelia had announced her engagement. This was the hallway where Richard had collapsed. This was the living room where I now sat, a queen on a throne of ashes, ruling over an empire of ghosts. The victory was mine, but it was a cold and lonely conquest. A few days, or maybe a week, slipped by in this gray, timeless haze. The world outside the windows continued its frantic dance. Reporters swapping shifts, curiosity seekers leaving morbid trinkets on my fence. But inside, time had ceased to have meaning. I didn't eat. I barely slept. I just sat, anchored to the armchair by the sheer weight of my own thoughts. Then, one afternoon, as the sun began to dip low, casting long, mournful shadows across the floor, I heard a sound that broke the spell. The soft, familiar creak of the back door. My heart gave a painful lurch. For a wild second, I thought it was a reporter who had finally found a way in. I braced myself. But it was Leo. He slipped into the kitchen as silently as a shadow, his young face pale and etched with a weariness that didn't belong on a boy his age. He looked older. He had seen too much. He didn't speak. There were no platitudes, no awkward questions about how I was holding up. He knew words were useless now. He walked across the living room, his sneakers silent on the thick rug, and came to a stop beside my chair. I looked up at him, and my eyes, dry for days, suddenly burned with tears. He just looked down at me, his own eyes filled with a deep, bottomless sorrow. He reached out and took my old, trembling hand in his. His was warm and strong. He wrapped his fingers around mine, a simple, grounding pressure, and we sat. We sat there for a long time as the sun set, bleeding orange and purple through the grimy windows. We didn't need to speak. In his touch, there was no judgment, no accusation. There was only a shared grief, a silent acknowledgement of the abyss we had stared into together. He was the co-conspirator in my terrible act of justice, and he was the only person on earth who could possibly understand the cost. A police car, still keeping its vigil at the end of the street, switched on its lights as dusk fell. The rhythmic, silent flashes of red and blue painted stripes across the walls, across our faces, a constant, pulsating reminder of the consequences of our truth. He was the anchor in my storm of silence. His quiet presence was the only thing keeping me from drifting away completely. I looked at his profile, silhouetted against the dying light, and a thought, clear and sharp, cut through the fog of my despair. He was the only good thing that had ever managed to grow from the poisoned soil of this family. Richard's cruelty, my weakness, Amelia's ambition, all of it had created a toxic landscape where nothing decent could thrive. And yet, here was Leo, kind, loyal, and brave Leo. He was all I had left. He was the one single seed of hope in a garden of ruin. The for sale sign on the lawn felt like a surrender. We sold the house for a fraction of its worth. The real estate agent, a woman with a perpetually nervous smile, had used the term stigmatized property, a polite euphemism for what everyone else was calling it, the murder house. Potential buyers would come, their faces a mixture of morbid fascination and apprehension. They would walk through the rooms not as if they were imagining their own lives there, but as if they were touring a museum exhibit. And they'd whisper in the garden, pointing towards the patch of earth where Richard had buried his secrets, now just a square of freshly turned, barren soil. We took the first lowball offer that came in, desperate to simply be rid of the place, to scrub its tainted memory from our lives. The final days were a blur of cardboard boxes and the hollow echo of empty rooms. We packed only what was essential, what was untainted by memory. The rest, the heavy oak furniture, the china, the portraits, we left behind for the new owners to dispose of. They were relics of a life that was no longer mine. On the last day, as Leo was loading the final box into his car, a letter arrived. The envelope was standard, from the county jail, but the return address made my blood run cold. It was from Amelia. My first instinct was to throw it away, to not let her voice, even on paper, penetrate the fragile peace I was trying to build. But I couldn't. I needed to know. I sat on the dusty floor of the empty living room and tore it open. It was 13 pages long, written in her familiar, sharp, angry script. I began to read. It was not a confession. It was not an apology. It was pure, undiluted venom, a torrent of narcissistic rage and blame. I had ruined her life. I had stolen her future. I had betrayed her. She wrote about Mark, about the life she was supposed to have, the status, the wealth, all of it snatched away by my selfish, vindictive act. She painted herself as the ultimate victim, a daughter wronged by a jealous, pathetic mother who couldn't bear to see her happy. I read the first page, my hand shaking. I scanned the second and the third. The words were the same, just rephrased, a litany of hatred. There was not a single word of remorse, not for her father's victims, not for her father's murder, not for the life she had tried to steal from me. In her mind, the only crime that had been committed was the one against her. That was all I needed to see. The last flicker of maternal guilt, the last lingering question of whether I had been too cruel, was extinguished. There was nothing left of my daughter to save. The poison had taken her completely. Without hesitation, I stood up, walked to the grand empty fireplace, and dropped the letter onto the cold stone hearth. I found a book of matches left on the mantelpiece, struck one, and held the flame to the corner of the first page. The paper curled, blackened, and then caught fire. I watched as the flames consumed her angry words, turning her rage into smoke and ash. It was a baptism by fire, a final, necessary cremation of a bond that had been toxic for far too long. Leo came back inside and saw me standing there, watching the last embers die. He didn't ask what it was. He just placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Ready to go?" he asked softly. I nodded, taking one last look around the empty room, a place that had held my entire adult life. It held no power over me anymore. The ghosts were quiet. As Leo drove us away from Havenwood, I didn't look back. I didn't watch the house that had been my cage shrink in the rearview mirror. I looked forward, through the windshield, at the open road. We were heading towards a small, anonymous apartment in a city where no one knew our names, where Croft was just a word, not a headline. The future was a terrifying empty canvas, a vast, white, unknown space with no map and no guide. But for the first time since I was a young bride, stepping into Richard Croft's perfect house, it was mine. It was finally, completely, mine to paint. My story, the story of the Poison Garden, is over. But I know, with a certainty that chills me, that there are thousands of other women and men still trapped in their own quiet prisons, their voices silenced by fear, by duty, by the people who are supposed to love them most. If you have ever felt unheard, if you have ever had to fight to reclaim a piece of yourself, share your story of finding your voice in the comments below. You never know whose cage your words might help to unlock.